A lioness ventures into a bustling village, causing panic. But her desperate mission reveals a story no one could expect. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The sun rose over Millbrook, a sleepy village nestled in the American heartland where routine defined daily life. Main Street bustled with its usual morning activity. Mr. Henderson unlocking his hardware store, Mrs. Patterson arranging fresh pastries in her bakery window, and school buses making their scheduled rounds. The village's 2,000 residents took pride in their predictable, peaceful existence. At the Central Park, wooden benches lined the perimeter of a well-maintained playground. Ethan Morris, a 23-year-old wildlife biology graduate, sat next to Sarah Coleman, 22, who was completing her veterinary studies. They watched as a group of elementary school children chased each other around the swing sets during their recess break. "Look at how they play without a care in the world," Sarah remarked, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. Her notebook lay open on her lap, filled with detailed sketches of local wildlife. She had spent the morning documenting the migration patterns of deer in the area. "Sometimes I wonder if we've lost that sense of freedom as adults." Ethan nodded, his attention divided between the playing children and a stack of conservation reports he'd brought to review. His worn backpack, covered in patches from various wildlife preserves, sat at his feet. "That's why I love working with animals. They remind me of that pure connection with nature we tend to forget." Their conversation shifted to their ongoing wildlife protection initiatives. Both had recently started a local program to educate villagers about the importance of preserving natural habitats. Their latest project involved creating a map of wildlife corridors around Millbrook. The peaceful scene shattered when a loud roar echoed through the village. The children froze mid-play, their faces turning from joy to terror. A large female lion emerged from between two houses, her muscular body tense and alert. This was Kira, though the villagers didn't know her name yet. Chaos erupted instantly. Parents rushed from nearby houses to grab their children. Store owners hurriedly ushered customers inside, slamming doors and pulling down shutters. Cars screeched to halts, and people abandoned their vehicles to run for shelter. Unlike the others, Ethan and Sarah remained rooted in place, their professional interest overriding their fear. They observed how the lioness moved, not aggressively, but with clear distress. Her head swayed from side to side, scanning the surroundings with intense focus. "Something's wrong," Ethan whispered, pulling out his phone to document the unusual behavior. "She's not hunting. Look at her body language. She's searching for something." The lioness made her way down the street, ignoring the screams and slamming doors. She paused near Sarah's house, a modest two-story building with blue shutters. Sarah watched from her position in the park as Kira approached her front porch, sniffing the air intently. The connection happened in an instant. Sarah's eyes met the lioness's gaze. Instead of seeing a predator, she recognized something familiar, the desperate look of a mother searching for her child. The lioness's eyes held a profound sadness and anxiety that transcended species. "Ethan," Sarah whispered, gripping his arm. "She's looking for her cub. That's why she's here. She must have lost it somewhere nearby." The village's silence was now punctuated only by the low growls of the distressed lioness and the distant sound of doors being locked. Through windows, curtains moved slightly as curious and frightened residents watched the scene unfold. The morning's peaceful routine had transformed into an unprecedented situation that would challenge the village's understanding of wildlife and conservation. Sarah's house became an unlikely focal point as Kira continued to investigate the area, her powerful paws moving with surprising delicacy across the manicured lawn. The contrast between the wild predator and the domesticated setting created a surreal tableau that would soon force the village to confront its relationship with the natural world. The village's emergency sirens wailed in the distance as Ethan and Sarah prepared for their expedition into the surrounding forest. In Sarah's garage, they gathered essential supplies: flashlights, first aid kit, water bottles, and a detailed map of the local terrain. Neither spoke about the obvious risks of tracking a distressed lioness. The forest spreads over 20 square miles, Ethan said, spreading the topographical map across Sarah's workbench. His finger traced the tree line where Kira had first appeared. If the cub is out there, we need to work systematically. Tom isn't on our side. Sarah packed her veterinary kit, including tranquilizers, a last resort she hoped they wouldn't need. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on both of them. One mistake could lead to tragedy, either for the lions or the increasingly agitated villagers. They entered the forest through a well-worn hiking trail, marking their path with bright orange ribbons. The summer heat had made the ground hard, but recent rains left enough softness for tracks. Ethan crouched frequently, examining the soil for signs of large paw prints. 3 hours into their search, they discovered the first concrete evidence. A campsite, hastily abandoned, lay scattered in a small clearing. An overturned cooler spilled its contents across the ground. Nearby, clear paw prints marked the earth. One set large, another significantly smaller. "Look at this," Sarah called, holding up a torn backpack. Tourist permits and maps spilled from its pockets. Someone was camping here illegally. The dates on these permits are expired by 2 weeks. Ethan photographed everything, particularly the tracks. The smaller prints are definitely from a cub, maybe 3 months old, based on the size. He pointed to disturbed undergrowth leading away from the camp. The tourists probably didn't even realize they had set up near a lion's temporary den. Their discovery was interrupted by voices carrying through the trees. Back in the village, a crowd had gathered in the central square. Sarah and Ethan crept closer to listen, staying hidden behind thick bushes at the forest's edge. Mayor Thompson stood on the courthouse steps, addressing 30 or so residents. Several held rifles, others clutched handwritten signs demanding action. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the square, adding to the ominous atmosphere. "We can't have a wild lion terrorizing our community," the mayor announced, his voice carrying clearly to where Sarah and Ethan hid. "I've contacted state wildlife services, but they're hours away. We need to protect ourselves." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Tom Wilson, the local hunting supply store owner, stepped forward. "I've got tranquilizer darts, but I say we don't take chances. That beast could kill someone's child." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. The irony wasn't lost on her. These people couldn't see that Kira was also protecting her child. She started to stand, ready to confront them, but Ethan pulled her back down. "We can't reason with them right now," he whispered. "They're too scared. Our best chance is to find the cub first." The meeting continued, with residents dividing into search parties. Some voiced concerns about using lethal force, but fear dominated the discussion. Maps were distributed, and teams began to form. The hunters among them checked their weapons with practiced efficiency. Time was running out. Sarah and Ethan retreated deeper into the forest, their original mission now even more urgent. They had to find the cub before the search parties began their hunt. The sound of trucks starting and car doors slamming spurred them to move faster. "We need help," Sarah said as they jogged along a deer trail. "People we can trust, who understand what we're trying to do." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts. "My study group from vet school. They're only an hour away. And your conservation team?" Ethan nodded, already typing messages. "I know at least 3 who will come right away. But we need to be careful about who we tell. One wrong person finds out our plan." The gravity of their situation settled over them like the lengthening afternoon shadows. They were racing against time, fear, and their own community's panic. The forest held its secrets close, and somewhere within it, a lost cub waited to be found. Sarah's grandmother, Eleanor Coleman, lived in a cottage at the edge of the village, where the manicured lawns gradually gave way to wild meadows. As dusk approached, Sarah and Ethan sought her counsel, knowing her 60 years in the village might provide crucial insights. Eleanor sat in her worn leather armchair, her silver hair neatly braided, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of chamomile tea. The walls of her living room displayed faded photographs documenting decades of local wildlife encounters. Among them, a particularly striking image showed a younger Eleanor treating an injured wolf. Before all these houses and paved roads, Eleanor began, her voice steady and clear. This entire area was shared territory. We understood something that folks seemed to have forgotten. We're visitors in their world, not the other way around. She stood, walking to a dusty bookshelf, and pulled out a leather-bound journal. Back in '82, we had a similar situation with a black bear and her cubs. The town wanted to shoot them on sight. Her fingers traced the yellowed pages. Instead, we created safe corridors for them to move through. Not a single person got hurt. How did you convince people? Sarah asked, leaning forward. Right now, they're ready to hunt Kira down. Eleanor's eyes crinkled with a knowing smile. Fear makes people irrational, but it also makes them predictable. We didn't try to fight the fear. We gave them a solution that made them feel in control. She turned another page in her journal. We organized watches, created warning systems, and most importantly, we helped them understand the animals weren't their enemies. Ethan studied the old photographs and documentation. The village was smaller then. People were more connected to nature. People haven't changed as much as you think, Eleanor countered. They still respond to leadership and clear plans. What they need now is someone to show them a better way. She fixed both young people with a penetrating gaze. Like you two are trying to do. Inspired by Eleanor's wisdom, Sarah and Ethan began making calls. Within an hour, their trusted circle started arriving. Maya Chun, a wildlife photographer with experience in big cat behavior, was the first to show up. Then came Carlos Rodriguez, an environmental law student who could help navigate the legal aspects of their intervention. They gathered in Eleanor's garage, converting it into an impromptu command center. Maps were spread across workbenches, and laptops displayed satellite imagery of the surrounding forest. The smell of coffee mixed with the musty scent of old tools and garden equipment. We need to work fast, Maya explained, pointing to thermal imaging she'd captured of the area. Lions are most active at dawn and dusk. That's our best window to find the cub. Carlos added his perspective. I've contacted the state wildlife authority. They've given us 4 hours before they come in with their team. After that, they'll take over, and their protocols might not prioritize keeping the family together. The group expanded as evening fell. Dr. James Wilson, a retired veterinarian, joined them, bringing medical supplies and expertise. 2 more conservation students arrived, along with a local forest ranger who quietly supported their cause. They worked through dinner, Eleanor providing sandwiches and continued wisdom. The garage buzzed with purposeful energy as they developed their strategy. Outside, the village's tension was palpable. Lights burned in windows usually dark at this hour, and occasional vehicle patrols passed by. We'll need to split into teams, Ethan decided, marking sectors on the map. Communications have to be silent. No radios, just text messages. If the armed groups find the cub first. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the stakes. Sarah organized the medical supplies, creating small kits for each team. Maya prepared her camera equipment, hoping to document everything, both for potential legal protection and to help change public opinion. Eleanor watched from her chair, nodding approvingly. You're doing the right thing, she said softly. Sometimes the hardest path is the only one worth taking. As midnight approached, the group made final preparations. They changed into dark clothing, checked their equipment one last time, and synchronized their phones. Through the garage windows, they could see flashlight beams in the distance. Other search parties were already active. Sarah hugged her grandmother goodbye. Thank you, she whispered. Eleanor squeezed her hand in response, slipping something into it. Her old wildlife journal. For courage, she said simply. The rescue teams moved out into the darkness, their hearts pounding with purpose and determination. They carried with them not just equipment and plans, but the weight of Eleanor's wisdom and the hope that they could bridge the gap between 2 worlds. The abandoned Galpeo stood like a dark sentinel at the forest's edge, its metal walls corroded by years of neglect. Moonlight filtered through holes in the roof, creating shifting patterns on the concrete floor. Sarah and Ethan led their team through the underbrush, every step calculated and silent. Maya positioned herself behind a fallen log, camera ready, while Carlos and Dr. Wilson maintained communication with the other teams via text. The night air carried the distant sounds of the armed search parties, voices, vehicles, and the occasional bark of a hunting dog. The thermal imaging shows something warm inside, Maya whispered, checking her equipment. It's small, probably hiding in the northwest corner. She adjusted her lens, trying to get a clearer reading through the building's walls. Their approach to the Galpeo required crossing 30 yards of exposed ground. They'd chosen this moment carefully. Clouds periodically obscured the moon, providing brief windows of deeper darkness. The armed groups seemed concentrated in the eastern forest, giving them a temporary advantage. Ethan led the first advance, crouching low. Each step was precise, avoiding the scattered debris that could give away their position. Sarah followed 10 paces behind, carrying the medical kit. The rest of the team maintained their positions, ready to provide support or distraction if needed. The tension peaked when a branch snapped somewhere in the darkness. Everyone froze. A beam of light swept the trees 300 yards to their right. Another search party. They held their positions, barely breathing, until the light moved on. Movement at 2 o'clock, Carlos texted. Through their phones' silent vibrations, they learned that one of their other teams had spotted Kira. The Lioness was circling the area, perhaps drawn by her cub's scent. This added urgency to their mission, but also increased the danger exponentially. As they closed in on the Galpeo's side entrance, Jack Thompson, one of the conservation students, caught his foot in a rusted piece of machinery. He fell forward, suppressing a cry of pain. Blood seeped through his torn pants leg. Ethan immediately backtracked. The injury wasn't severe, but it could compromise their mission. Without speaking, he helped Jack to a sitting position behind an old oil drum. Dr. Wilson moved in silently, administering first aid with practiced efficiency. The incident forced them to adjust their plan. Jack would need to remain outside with Dr. Wilson, reducing their team size but adding another set of eyes on their perimeter. Sarah squared her shoulders, knowing they had to continue despite the setback. The side door's hinges protested softly as Ethan eased it open. The sound seemed thunderous in their heightened state of awareness. They paused, listening for any reaction from either the cub inside or the search parties outside. Only cricket songs and distant owls broke the night silence. Maya's camera clicked softly, documenting everything. These photos might prove crucial later, especially if confronted by authorities or angry villagers. They needed to prove they'd acted responsibly and with proper care. The team's text chain buzzed again. Kira was moving closer. They had maybe 20 minutes before she reached their position. The armed search parties were also changing patterns, sweeping west in a movement that would eventually bring them to the Galpeo. Sarah felt her grandmother's journal in her pocket, drawing strength from it as they prepared to enter the building. Everything they'd planned, every risk they were taking, came down to the next few minutes. The wisdom of the past, the urgency of the present, and the hope for the future converged in this singular moment. Ethan pulled out his flashlight, but didn't activate it yet. They would work in darkness as long as possible, using the ambient moonlight filtering through the roof. Their eyes had adjusted well, and they could make out the basic layout of the Galpeo's interior. Old machinery, stacked crates, and years of accumulated debris. A soft whimper echoed from the darkness ahead, confirming Maya's thermal reading. The cub was here, scared and alone, waiting for a reunion that could end in either tragedy or triumph. The next few moments would determine which outcome prevailed. Inside the Galpeo, dust motes danced in the thin shafts of moonlight. The air hung heavy with the scent of rust and abandoned machinery. Sarah and Ethan moved with calculated precision, their footsteps muffled by years of settled dirt. They could hear the cub's soft whimpers growing more distinct as they approached the northwest corner. There, Ethan whispered, pointing to a stack of wooden crates partially collapsed against the wall. Through a gap in the debris, two reflective eyes shone back at them. The cub had wedged itself into a makeshift den, a space barely visible unless you knew where to look. Sarah pulled out her phone, keeping its brightness at minimum, and consulted the wildlife manual she'd downloaded. Male approximately 3 months old, she murmured, observing the cub's visible features. Dehydrated, but no obvious injuries. Their earpieces buzzed with Maya's urgent update from outside. Kira's getting closer. 800 yards and closing. Southeast search party also approaching, about 15 minutes out. The timeline was compressing rapidly. The cub retreated further into its hiding spot when Ethan took a step forward. Its small body trembled, torn between fear and exhaustion. Empty food wrappers scattered nearby suggested it had been surviving on scraps dropped by trespassers, explaining why it had remained in the Galpeo instead of trying to find its mother. "We need to earn his trust quickly," Sarah said, reaching into her medical kit. She pulled out a sterile water pouch and a collapsible bowl. The sound of tearing plastic made the cub flinch. "He's too weak to run, but scared enough to bite if we rush this." Ethan positioned himself to block any potential escape routes while maintaining a non-threatening posture. Years of wildlife rehabilitation experience guided his movements as he settled into a crouch. "Talk to him," he suggested. "Not baby talk, just DY, calm voices like we use at the sanctuary." Sarah began speaking in low, soothing tones while preparing the water. She mixed in a pediatric electrolyte solution, knowing dehydration was their immediate concern. The cub's ears twitched at her voice, showing the first signs of interest rather than fear. A distant roar froze everyone in place. Kira was announcing her presence, perhaps sensing her cub was near. The sound galvanized them. They were running out of time. Through their earpieces, they heard Carlos reporting movement from the armed search parties, their flashlight beams visible through the trees. "We have to move now," Ethan said, his voice tight with tension. "If those search parties reach us before we can get him to Kira..." He left the sentence unfinished. They all knew the potential consequences. Sarah placed the water bowl just within reach of the cub's hiding spot and backed away slowly. Seconds stretched like hours as they waited, watching the small creature wage an internal battle between thirst and fear. Finally, hunger and exhaustion won out. The cub emerged cautiously, heading for the water. In the improved lighting, they could see its condition clearly. Though undernourished, the cub's coat still held a healthy sheen, and its movements, while cautious, showed no signs of serious injury. It lapped desperately at the water, giving them their first real opportunity to assess it properly. Maya's voice crackled in their ears again. "Kira's pace is picking up. She must have caught his scent. 500 yards out." Another roar, closer this time, punctuated her words. The metal walls of the Galpeo seemed to vibrate with its power. The cub's head snapped up at the sound, water dripping from its muzzle. Recognition flashed in its eyes. It knew its mother's call. For the first time, it moved toward them voluntarily, drawn by the sound of Kira's voice rather than retreating in fear. "Now's our chance," Ethan breathed, slowly reaching for the specialized transport carrier they'd brought. But before he could open it, sharp voices cut through the night air. The search party was closer than they'd realized, their flashlight beams now visible through the Galpeo's broken windows. Time had run out. They needed to make a decision: stick to their careful plan or adapt to the rapidly deteriorating situation. The cub stood between them and safety. Kira was approaching from one direction, and armed villagers from another. Their next move would determine not just the fate of the cub, but potentially the entire village's relationship with the wilderness that surrounded them. With practiced movements born from years of wildlife handling, Ethan inched forward. The cub, still focused on its mother's calls, watched him with less fear than before. Sarah maintained her steady stream of calm words, creating a buffer of sound between them and the growing chaos outside. "Easy now, little one," Ethan murmured, his hands steady as he slowly reached for the cub. Years of rehabilitation work had taught him the precise balance of confidence and caution needed. The cub, weakened by hunger and dehydration, offered surprisingly little resistance as Ethan carefully secured it. Sarah immediately began a quick medical assessment, her hands moving efficiently over the small body. Mild dehydration, slightly elevated heart rate, but otherwise stable, she reported in clipped professional tones. The cub trembled but remained relatively calm in Ethan's grip. Their earpieces crackled with urgent updates. Maya's voice was tense. Armed group approaching from the north entrance. 3 minutes, maybe less. Kira's changed direction. She's heading straight for the building now. The situation was converging faster than they'd anticipated. Through gaps in the walls, they could see flashlight beams growing closer, accompanied by the sound of boots on gravel. The search party was coordinating their approach, their voices carrying clearly through the night. "Tier, check all entrances," someone called out. "If it's in there, we don't want it escaping." Sarah met Ethan's eyes in the dim light. Their carefully constructed plan was unraveling. The transport carrier they brought now seemed like a liability. Too slow, too cumbersome for what they needed to do. They had to adapt. "We go directly to Kira," Sarah decided, her voice firm despite the fear evident in her eyes. "No carrier, no dirás." It's not ideal, but it's our only chance. The risk was enormous. Approaching a desperate mother lion with her cub would challenge every wildlife handling protocol they knew. Ethan nodded, adjusting his hold on the cub to ensure both security and comfort. The small creature had become oddly quiet, perhaps sensing the gravity of the moment. Its eyes reflected the moving flashlight beams that now crisscrossed the building's interior. Their teammates outside coordinated a distraction. Carlos and Dr. Wilson began moving noisily through the underbrush away from the building, drawing some of the search party's attention. Maya repositioned herself to document what was about to happen, her camera ready to capture either a miracle or a tragedy. Sarah led the way toward the building's rear exit, moving as quickly as they dared. The cub remained surprisingly cooperative, as if understanding its salvation depended on their success. Through their earpieces, they could hear the increasingly urgent updates about Kira's approach. They reached the door just as voices echoed from the front of the building. "In here! Check behind those crates." The search party had entered through the main entrance. Sarah eased the rear door open, praying the hinges wouldn't betray them. Cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of adult lion. Kira was close, very close. The cub stirred in Ethan's arms, responding to its mother's proximity. They could hear her breathing somewhere in the darkness beyond the door. The moment of truth had arrived. Everything they'd planned, every risk they'd taken, led to this crucial decision. Behind them, flashlight beams and voices grew closer. Ahead lay darkness and a desperate mother lion. There was no middle ground, no safe compromise. The cub made a small sound, barely more than a whimper, but it was enough. From the darkness came an answering rumble. Kira had heard her baby. There was no turning back now. They stepped through the door into the night, carrying precious cargo and desperate hope. The night air crackled with tension as Ethan and Sarah emerged from the Galpeo. 20 yards ahead, Kira's massive form materialized from the darkness. Her muscles rippled under her tawny coat, her eyes fixed on her cub. The moonlight caught her features, revealing an expression that mixed desperate hope with primal ferocity. The cub squirmed in Ethan's arms, responding to its mother's presence. His arms ached from maintaining the secure but gentle hold. One wrong move, one startled reaction could trigger disaster. Sarah stood slightly ahead of him, her body language deliberately non-threatening as she guided their movements. "Stay absolutely still," Sarah whispered, though Ethan hardly needed the reminder. Years of wildlife training felt inadequate in the face of this raw, primal moment. Kira's eyes locked onto her cub, then shifted between the two humans, calculating, assessing. Through their earpieces, Maya's voice trembled slightly. Armed group inside the galpao now. Seconds before they reached the rear door. "Whatever you're going to do it fast." The sound of men shouting behind them added urgency to an already critical situation. The cub let out another cry, louder this time, reaching for its mother. Kira responded with a low rumble that vibrated through the ground. She took one step forward, then another, her movements fluid and purposeful. The distance between them shrank to 15 yards, then 12. Sarah fought every instinct that screamed at her to run. Instead, she began slowly lowering herself to a crouch, signaling Ethan to do the same. They needed to appear as non-threatening as possible while maintaining control of the situation. The cub's increasing struggles made this increasingly difficult. "Easy," Ethan murmured, though whether to the cub, to Kira, or to himself wasn't clear. Sweat trickled down his back despite the cool night air. One wrong move could trigger Kira's protective instincts with devastating results. Behind them, the rear door of the Galpeo burst open. "Over here," someone shouted. The beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating their position. Kira growled. Her attention suddenly split between her cub and the new threat. Time compressed into a singular, crucial moment. They couldn't wait any longer. With deliberate movements, Ethan began to lower the cub to the ground. Sarah maintained eye contact with Kira, her body positioned to shield both Ethan and the cub from the approaching search party. "Hold your fire," Sarah called out, her voice carrying authority she didn't feel. "Nobody move." To their surprise, the command worked. The search party froze, perhaps stunned by the scene before them. The cub touched the ground, its small paws finding purchase on the earth. Kira's focus snapped back to her baby, her entire body tense with anticipation. Ethan and Sarah began their carefully practiced retreat, each step measured and slow. The distance between mother and cub shrank with agonizing slowness. Each second felt like an eternity as natural instinct fought against human interference. The cub took one tentative step toward its mother, then another, its movement growing more confident with each passing moment. Maya's camera clicked rapidly in the background, documenting every second of this extraordinary reunion. The armed villagers remained frozen, their weapons lowered, transfixed by the unfolding scene. Even the night seemed to hold its breath. Finally, inevitably, mother and cub met. Kira's massive head lowered to nuzzle her baby, her previous aggression melting into tender concern. The cub pressed against her leg, their reunion punctuated by soft sounds of recognition and relief. The scene unfolding before the gathered crowd transcended the normal boundaries between human and wild. Kira thoroughly inspected her cub, turning it gently with her nose, licking its fur, checking for any injuries. The cub responded with small mewls of contentment, pressing against its mother's warmth. Rifles lowered one by one as the armed villagers witnessed this profound display of maternal care. Tom Wilson, who had been most vocal about using lethal force, slowly removed his finger from his weapon's trigger. His weathered face showed the first signs of understanding dawning. "It's just like watching my own kids," someone whispered from the crowd. The comment rippled through the group, changing the atmosphere from tension to something approaching wonder. The similarity between Kira's protective instincts and human parental love became impossible to ignore. Sarah and Ethan maintained their position, still acting as a buffer between the lions and the villagers. Maya continued documenting everything, her camera capturing the gradual transformation of the community's response. Each click preserved evidence of how fear could give way to empathy. The first applause started softly, just a few hesitant claps from the back of the group. Within moments, it spread, growing in a genuine appreciation for what they were witnessing. The sound startled Kira, but she seemed to sense the change in energy, her posture relaxing slightly. "I never thought." Tom Wilson stepped forward, his rifle now pointed firmly at the ground. "All this time, we were ready to—" He couldn't finish the sentence, emotion choking his words. The reality of what they'd almost done weighed heavily on the assembled group. Dr. Wilson moved through the crowd, offering quiet explanations of what they were seeing. His veterinary expertise helped translate the lion's behavior into terms the villagers could understand. "Notice how she's checking the cub's health, just like any parent would," he observed, adding scientific context to the emotional moment. The transformation wasn't just in the observers' attitudes. Kira herself seemed to sense the shift. While maintaining a protective stance near her cub, her aggressive posture had softened. She began grooming her baby with methodical care, ignoring the humans as if finally convinced they posed no threat. Phones emerged from pockets as people recorded the scene, but Maya noticed something significant. They weren't filming out of fear or sensation-seeking anymore. Instead, they were capturing a moment of profound connection between species, a reminder of shared experiences across the animal kingdom. Sarah felt tears rolling down her cheeks, unashamed of showing emotion. Years of wildlife advocacy had taught her that sometimes the most powerful conservation tool was simply allowing people to witness natural behavior firsthand. This moment would do more for wildlife protection than any number of lectures or pamphlets. "We need to give them space now," Ethan announced, his voice carrying quiet authority. The crowd responded immediately, taking collective steps backward. The mood had shifted so dramatically that no one questioned his expertise anymore. They had seen the results of trusting his approach. As if acknowledging this final gesture of respect, Kira turned toward the forest, gently nudging her cub in that direction. They moved unhurriedly, dignity in every step. The villagers watched in respectful silence as the two lions disappeared into the darkness, their forms gradually fading until only the memory of this extraordinary encounter remained. In the days following the reunion, the village underwent a profound transformation. The morning after the event found Harold Peterson, the farmer who had led the charge against Kira, sitting quietly in his pickup truck at the edge of his property. He watched the sun rise over his fields with new eyes, noticing for the first time how his land bordered the wildlife corridor. Sarah found him there, his usual stern expression replaced by thoughtful contemplation. "I've been thinking," he said as she approached, not taking his eyes off the horizon. 30 years I've worked this land, never once considering I might be part of the problem." His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with emotion. Harold's confession opened a floodgate of similar revelations throughout the community. At the local diner, conversations shifted from fear of wildlife to discussions of coexistence. The walls, once decorated with hunting trophies, now featured Maya's photographs of the reunion, including a striking image of Kira nuzzling her cub. "I was wrong," Harold continued, finally turning to face Sarah. "We've been pushing them out of their territory bit by bit, year after year. Then we act surprised when they show up in our spaces." His voice carried the weight of decades of misunderstanding. "Maybe it's time we learn to share." The village council called an emergency meeting at the community center. Unlike the angry gathering days before, this one had a different energy. Tables were arranged in a circle, symbolizing equality and shared responsibility. Every seat was filled with people standing along the walls, eager to participate. Mayor Thompson, humbled by recent events, opened the floor for discussion. "We need to talk about our relationship with the wildlife around us," he began. "Not as adversaries, but as neighbors sharing the same space." Dr. Wilson presented data on local wildlife patterns, explaining how human development had impacted animal territories. Maps were spread across tables, showing how residential expansion had fragmented natural habitats. The community leaned in, asking questions, seeking understanding, rather than confrontation. Sarah and Ethan shared their expertise, but more importantly, they listened. Farmers expressed concerns about livestock protection, parents worried about their children's safety, and hunters spoke about maintaining their traditions. Each concern was acknowledged and addressed with respect. The transformation wasn't just in words. Harold stood up during the meeting, surprising everyone by offering to donate 10 acres of his land to create a natural buffer zone. "It's not much," he said gruffly, "but it's a start." His gesture inspired others. Soon, a patchwork of voluntary wildlife corridors began taking shape on the village map. The council drafted new guidelines for development, incorporating wildlife protection into future planning. Local businesses pledged to modify their practices, from installing better waste management systems to reducing light pollution that disturbed nocturnal animals. Tom Wilson, the hunting supply store owner, announced he would start stocking more photography equipment alongside his traditional inventory. "Times are changing," he explained. "Maybe we can shoot with cameras more often than rifles." As the meeting progressed into evening, the atmosphere grew increasingly hopeful. Plans were made to establish a local wildlife response team, trained to handle future encounters without resorting to violence. Sarah's grandmother Eleanor was asked to share her historical knowledge, bridging the gap between past wisdom and present needs. The village that had once armed itself against a desperate mother now began arming itself with knowledge, understanding, and compassion. It wasn't just about Kira and her cub anymore. It was about redefining their community's place in the natural world. In the warm glow of sunset, a week after the reunion, the village gathered again, this time for an unexpected revelation. Jack Thompson, one of Sarah and Ethan's team members, stood before the crowd with his laptop connected to the community center's projector. His hands trembled slightly as he prepared to share what he'd captured. "I wasn't just filming for documentation," he explained, pressing play. The video began with Kira's reunion with her cub, but then continued, showing something remarkable. In the footage, a small tracking collar was visible on Kira's neck, previously unnoticed in the chaos of the moment. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a wildlife biologist from the State Conservation Department, stepped forward. "Kira is part of our lion rehabilitation program," she revealed, her words sending murmurs through the crowd. "She's one of 12 lions we've been monitoring to understand their adaptation to shrinking habitats." The screen filled with years of data. Maps showing Kira's territory, her hunting patterns, her careful avoidance of human settlements until the disappearance of her cub. The video had already gone viral on social media, attracting millions of views and catching the attention of international conservation organizations. Your village's response has become a case study in human-wildlife conflict resolution, Dr. Martinez continued. Several major conservation groups have expressed interest in establishing a research and education center here. The announcement was met with stunned silence, then growing excitement. The viral video had transformed their small village into a symbol of hope. Messages poured in from around the world. Offers of support, requests for guidance, and stories of similar challenges in other communities. Local children proudly shared their own drawings and stories of Kira and her cub with online audiences. Mayor Thompson, reading from his tablet, announced the first concrete result of their newfound fame. The International Wildlife Conservation Fund has offered to fund a sanctuary on the outskirts of our village. They want to use our experience as a model for other communities facing similar situations. The sanctuary proposal included plans for wildlife, e-corridors, research facilities, and educational programs. What had begun as a crisis was evolving into an opportunity for the village to reinvent itself as a pioneer in conservation. Harold Peterson's daughter, Emily, a recent environmental science graduate, stood up with tears in her eyes. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet room, "this is why I chose my major. I always hoped our village could be more than just another place where humans and wildlife couldn't coexist." The final piece of the puzzle came from the tracking data. Dr. Martinez's team had discovered that Kira's territory was part of an ancient migratory route, one that development had slowly eroded. The village's new wildlife corridors would help restore these vital pathways, benefiting not just lions, but numerous species. As the meeting concluded, Sarah and Ethan found themselves surrounded by children eager to learn about wildlife conservation. The fear that had once gripped the village had transformed into curiosity and enthusiasm. Even Tom Wilson's hunting supply store had begun offering wildlife photography workshops. The story's true ending wasn't just about a mother lion finding her cub. It was about a community finding its place in the natural world. The village that had once armed itself against wildlife now armed itself with knowledge, becoming a beacon of hope for human-wildlife coexistence. In the months that followed, Kira and her cub were occasionally spotted in the designated wildlife corridors, healthy and thriving. Their presence, once a source of terror, had become a symbol of pride for the village. Trail cameras captured their movements, contributing to research that would help other communities navigate similar challenges. The transformation was complete. A crisis had become an opportunity. Fear had given way to understanding, and a small village had discovered that sometimes the best way to protect ourselves is to protect the wild things that share our world. The end.